My first job after college, I went to work for Southwestern Bell. I was very excited to go to work for a large corporation. This is back before everything divested. It was when all the baby bells were connected and AT&T was still the parent company. And I was hired in as what's called a marketing administrator. I was not the lead person on a team, but I was really supporting them and really caring for the customer. I had my own list of smaller customers, but my job was to take care of the client and represent them to Bell and all the different duties and divisions. As part of my training, back then they used to do training, took several months. I mean, like almost a year for training. A lot of what I was trained to do was to learn the rules of how things work. Does anybody else know? I mean, if you've ever worked for a large corporation, you've got to learn how the rules work. I had to learn things like, if you want and I was in the business part, so if you want a business phone, it took 3 days. If you want a line move, it took 5 days. I mean, there were hundreds of things I had to learn. And there were very strict rules on how things were done. And they impressed upon us over and over and over. We were tested, we had to recite them. We had to learn these things so that people would, follow them. And there's nothing wrong with the rules. The rules help things get done. It helped planning. It allowed planning for people to do repairs, and it was a good thing overall. But I found when I started, and actually started working in after training, I'd soon get calls, and I found something kind of funny. Do you know that our clients didn't care about our rules? They'd have a need, and they say, I need this now. I need this tomorrow. And in the first few days, this happened almost on my first day of work in my office, and I would say something like, I knew the answer to this. You get it in 3 days, or you get it in 5 days. We'll get it there as soon as we can, but I believe it'll be 5 days. But I wasn't satisfied with that answer. It left me uncomfortable, because often I found, even from the very beginning, that people genuinely had a need. Something happened and they really needed help. And I started watching my peers, people who were doing what I was doing, and there was a handful of them. I have to say this, they didn't play by the rules. They learned how to get things done. But I really respected them because they really were helping their clients, the people they worked with. And I started watching what they do, and I thought I learned reasonably quick, and I suddenly realized how much you can get done with 24 donuts to an installer. I learned how much I can get done by a bucket of chicken to someone else at just the right time. Because my goal was to take care of the client. That's why I was there. That was my purpose. My goal was not keeping the rules. I will tell you, the other thing I learned this also very quickly. There are many people who did not share my view. Many other people said that, no, we're here to make sure those rules are followed. And I'll tell you, sometimes people got a little annoyed with me when I insisted there was a better way of doing this. And they got real angry with me. But I learned something else. Do you know what? In a chain of command, there's always somebody above them. And I learned when someone had an emergency and I'm representing that person to all the divisions of Bell, which were all over the world, literally, no is not an acceptable answer. And I would keep going up the chain until finally someone understood and had the authority to get it done. And I learned you could get things done outside of the rules. It's not that the rules are wrong. They're helpful and they're useful. But our goal was to take care of the client so they could do business. Today's passage reminds me a great deal of what I experienced when I work at Bell. And I want to talk about that. Is it more important to keep the rules or to keep that goal in mind of what's most important? And frankly, the tension between those two things. To look at this, we're going to go to Matthew. I want to go to Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, because at the end of chapter 11, Jesus has been talking to his disciples and getting them ready, dealing with all the oppression, but he makes a very strong statement. He has the audacity to say, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I will do it. Okay? Weary are those things, those labors, those things that we do that cause us. It's the things I do that cause me to be weary, okay? The burden stuff is all that other stuff that people put on top of you to carry. But here's the kicker. Jesus says, I'm the one that's going to give you rest. Rest is not, as much as I wish it was some days, it's not, going to the beach and putting your feet up or even sleeping in a hammock. Rest is making things right between you and God and making things right as much as possible between you and those around you. That state of peace, that state of wholeness, that's what he's talking about here. See, this leads right into chapter 12. And so let's go to chapter 12, verse 1. It starts by saying at that time, which is, that phrase actually ties us to chapter 11, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. They're wheat fields is what they are, on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. Okay, there's nothing illegal about the disciples walking through a grain field and taking a handful of grain to eat it. In fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, it's perfectly allowable for someone who's really hungry just to take a handful of grain and eat it. Also in that passage, you deal with the gleaning idea, where if a farmer has a big field, they're supposed to leave a little bit in the field, a little on the ground, so the poor could follow along afterwards and collect what needs to be collected. You remember the book of Ruth? Ruth did that in Boaz's field. That's how they took care, they expected that to happen. So there's nothing inherently wrong with them taking the grain. The problem is if they're doing it on the Sabbath. Now that's a problem. And let me show you why on the next verse, because the Pharisees start saying, when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Now, you need to know there's a body of law separate from what we call the Old Testament. And in this body of man-made law, they had 30 different types of rules related to working on the Sabbath. And one of them was you can't harvest wheat on the Sabbath. Because see, when I pick some heads of grain to eat, there is reaping, threshing, whittling, and preparing food, all in that little act. I have 4 laws I've broken. And I'll tell you, that's a big deal. So we go to the next verse and you can see what happens. Jesus responds with this. Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? Let's go on to 4. He entered into the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but for the priests. Jesus took him back. He said, have you not read? He took him back to 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. David had come in fleeing from King Saul. He'd come to the tabernacle. He'd gone to the priests there and said, look, do you have anything to eat? And they all go, we don't have anything to eat except the consecrated bread we're about to put on the altar. And because of their mercy, they gave the bread to David to eat and to share with his men. And Jesus is saying, don't you see the parallel here? And then the second thing he goes is a second answer. If you go to the next verse in verse 5, Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath day in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? What Jesus is saying here, look, you're not thinking straight on what you're talking about. The priests themselves work on the Sabbath. They work twice as hard on the Sabbath. Think of all the animals that have to be slaughtered and cut up, and big fires have to be built, and everything's got to be, all the sacrifices have to be prepared, and all that's going on there. They worked extremely hard on the Sabbath, twice as hard on the Sabbath than any other day. But because it's what the law required, what God asked them to do, it's not seen to be wrong. So Jesus is challenging their way of thinking. But he pushes it pretty hard when he goes to this next verse. He says, I tell you that something or someone greater than the temple is here. Jesus is saying, I'm greater than the temple. I'm greater than the priests. This probably captured their attention pretty well. And you see it even more strongly in verse 7 when he says, if you had known what these words mean, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. He's getting right to the heart of this. Is it more important to do stuff, to give stuff, to do what we're supposed to do on a day, or is it more important to have the right attitude when we do it? Is it attitude or action? What makes the most difference? And Jesus is saying mercy is what God desires. Compassion. It's love, but I would say it's the bullseye of love. It's that mercy, it's compassion. It's when you hurt for someone and are compelled to act, to do something about it. Is that your motive? Or are you more concerned of keeping the rules? If I do this and this and this, I've done it. I've done the right things. I've worshiped today. Do you see the tension between those two things? You would not have condemned the innocent. What he's saying is, your motive should be mercy. Your heart should be compassion. And he pushes it to now the next verse. For the Son of Man, and this is how Jesus refers to himself, is Lord of the Sabbath. He is saying that I am the King. This is my day, that I am in charge of all things. I have authority over all things. I am greater than the temple. I'm greater than the priests. I'm greater than David. I'm greater than all of this. I define the Sabbath, not you, by your laws. And I define the Sabbath by my mercy and my compassion, not by what rules you keep. This is hard stuff. But it's terribly important stuff as we think about coming together. Because look at verse 9 here. Verse 9 says, going on from that place, he went into their synagogue. Now, I need to stop there for a second. I don't know if you read this with me. He went into their synagogue. He went to the place where the Pharisees led worship. The ones that were accusing him, the ones that were following him around, the ones watching his every move, hoping they can catch him to do something, hoping he'll make a mistake and they can charge him. He's going to their synagogue. Why? He's just said he's Lord of the Sabbath. Why does he need to go? Because that's his habit. He goes to honor his Father in worship. That's what he does. And so he goes to that synagogue. Now, let's see what happens there. And there just happens to be a man with a shriveled hand on the front row. Was it a plant? I don't know. Probably. Generally, people that had a disability were thought somehow either sinful or somehow under God's curse, and they would probably be in the back of the synagogue, honestly, kind of out of sight. But here is this guy sitting on the front row. He has a shriveled hand. Now, you need to note that this is really actually important. The law would, and even the man-made body of law, but the law said if there was a real emergency, if someone had a terrible cut, you could stop. There's things you could do on the Sabbath to stop the bleeding. So but this isn't that. This man has a shriveled hand. It's probably been like that for years. It's not life-threatening. Okay. Now, look what happens. Oh, go back one. I'm sorry, Jeff. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. Do you think these guys came to worship, by the way? They came to look for reasons to charge. Looking for reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? I want you to think about something. They had no doubt that Jesus could heal this guy. Do you realize that? They had no doubt Jesus could heal. They've either seen it themselves or they've heard about it, not even a question. The question for them is, would he do this on the Sabbath? That's the only thing that mattered. It's not that if he could do it. They knew he could do it. They just said, are you going to do it on the Sabbath? That'll be the point. That's going to be the one we're going to get in trouble with. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now, I want to talk about the word lawful just for a second. It means what's possible. What could happen? Is it the right thing to do to heal, to make whole on the Sabbath? I want you to think about what a question to ask. But they were asking it. And they were waiting for Jesus to see what he would say. Go to the next verse. Jesus said to them, now I want you to know something. All the way through Matthew, Jesus was portrayed two things. One, he's always portrayed as a man with great compassion towards all people. And he's always teaching. He's always preaching, but he's always teaching. Do you realize that he's showing compassion to the Pharisees now by what he says? He's teaching them the truth. He's answering their question with a question. He's making them think. He's making them struggle with what they are sure is right. I love this. So he answers them with a question. If any of you have a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? Now, I want you to think about something. This has nothing to do with compassion or mercy. It has everything to do with money. A sheep was worth a lot of money. And if you had something of value, great value, even on the Sabbath, and it fell into a pit and you could pull it out to save it, would you do it? Yes. And that becomes even more clear with the next verse because he says to them, how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Do you ever think this one verse shows the value of human beings? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? And then he makes his conclusion. Therefore, it is lawful, it is right, it is possible. It's what you should do. You should do good on the Sabbath. Now, did you catch that he's changed their question? They asked, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Jesus says, no. What's lawful is to do good on the Sabbath. Do you see how Jesus defines the day? What are you talking? It's not just lawful to heal. You're supposed to do good. Now, Jesus defines good. Didn't I read that somewhere? Love God with all your God and love your neighbor as yourself. That's what it means to do good. So do good on the Sabbath. Doing good is showing mercy. Doing good is showing compassion. Jesus was saying, I didn't break the Sabbath by doing good. Nobody breaks the Sabbath by doing good. I can almost feel his frustration at this point. And if you go to the next slide, can you imagine in this full synagogue? I'm sure it was full. Everybody knew Jesus was there. And here's this man, everybody hears this interchange going on. They heard Jesus say, therefore it's good to do, therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And at this point, Jesus turns to the man. He never forgets the individual need, folks. Every single time in Scripture I can't find a single time he misses them, the individual. He had compassion for this man as much as he had compassion for the Pharisees, but he never forgot the guy with the need. And at this point, well, even though he's frustrated with the Pharisees and their hardness of heart, he turns to this man and says, stretch out your hand. Can you imagine that? Down front, everybody's watching, his hands up. I tried to picture what would happen. If this guy, he put his hand up and he hasn't been able to stretch out his hand in years maybe, and he puts his hand out and all of a sudden it works. His hand starts moving. What would happen? Were people excited? Were they clapping? Did they cry? Were they, what was the guy? I don't even know what the man could. He was probably speechless, but happy, overflowing. And note something. It was completely restored, just as sound as the other. The word heal at its heart means to make whole, to make right. Jesus did that for this man. But let me tell you how people responded to it. Verse 14 is one of the saddest verses in Scripture. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Do you see a little bit of a problem here? Jesus saying, the Sabbath is about showing mercy. The Sabbath is about, it's lawful to do good. And they chose at this point to go out and plot how they may kill Jesus. Do you realize they were committing sin by talking about doing this? They broke their own laws. So how do we deal with the Sabbath today? You obviously realize we don't worship on Friday evening or Saturday evening. The Sabbath runs Friday night to Saturday night. We're worshiping here on Sunday morning. Well, we gather together on Sunday mornings because that's the day the early church gathered to say it's a celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Every Sunday is a little Easter. Okay. Sunday has not replaced Friday night to Saturday night as Sabbath. This is not the Sabbath. Jesus said he's Lord of the Sabbath, and that means it's not about a day anymore, it's about Jesus. You with me? It's not an hour on Sunday morning or even 24 hours from Friday evening to Saturday evening. It's about Jesus. We still need to gather together. We need that. We're told to do that throughout. We've got to gather as believers as part of our rhythm of living. We need to work hard, but there needs to be time when we stop and we come together and be before Jesus and rest. Now, I don't mean go to sleep, hopefully not during my sermon, but but we need to rest together in His presence and in the presence of others around us. That's what we should be doing. Excuse me. Even though we have an altar, we don't practice animal sacrifices because our Father, because of His compassion, gave us the perfect sacrifice. We never have to make another sacrifice again. We have a new covenant that's based totally on the work and the person of Christ. And truthfully, as a follower of Jesus, each day is a Sabbath day for me. I worship every day Him. I rest in Him every day. Excuse me. And that's important. So what do we do with this passage then? Where do we go with it? Okay, here's my application. This Saturday's Touch a Truck. We will be having trucks and vehicles from all over everywhere, all around this campus. We have people working at every vehicle, I believe, every truck. There will be people serving food. There'll be people greeting people. There's going to be people at the prayer tent, everywhere. We really are expecting about 2,000 people. I want to give you a challenge. What if we think of this Saturday as a Sabbath day? Now, what I mean of that, it's not just a day where we as volunteers keep kids in line and make sure things run smoothly. But what if it's a day that we understand that we're to do good that day, actively do good? What if it's a day that we're called to do acts of mercy, compassion on every single person that comes through here? Do you realize a large percentage of our population around us find that most Christians are more like the Pharisees than Jesus? I need to say it. If you don't know that, you need to know it. Most people, particularly young people, really believe that we're more like the Pharisees than Jesus. My goal to everyone who's a volunteer, including me, is, do I understand on this day, I want to show compassion to every person I meet. That means I hurt for them as the day goes, but also I'm going to do everything I can to help someone if I can help them. I want to do good that day. Good in the sense of loving your neighbor as yourself kind of good. May we offer mercy, compassion, not just to our guests, but how about to all those coming in with vehicles? Most of whom don't go to church here. How about all and each other? Helping each other, lifting up each other. When someone goes out, when a family leaves, saying, I'm not real fond of Christians, but I'll tell you, this church, I got to tell you, they're doing it differently than I have seen it. I felt their care. I felt their compassion. That will be my goal for this week. And I think it's in the DNA of this church to do that. That's who we are. But you need to know something. We can't just do it by ourselves. It happens as we rest in the Holy Spirit and allow the Holy Spirit to empower us to do this. I don't just choose to offer Jesus' compassion. I have to be empowered to do that. I can't just offer His mercy. I've got to be empowered to offer His mercy. And that comes from the Spirit working through us. Through the day on Saturday, check yourself and say, Lord, help me. It's going to be hot, probably. It's going to be tiring. I know that. But we have a God who doesn't wear out and doesn't tire out. He'll give you what you need when you need it. There's going to be people there that need a hand, help, people that need a seat, people that are just looking for something. Are we willing to step forward to do our mission, which is this next slide? Our mission here is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And if you'll go that last slide, Jeff, for me. We are a church, we say we're a church that wants to worship passionately. And what that means is, I think at heart, we're not just about worshiping on 1 hour or 2 hours on Sunday. We want to be a church that worships passionately every day of the week, all day long. That's who we are. We are a church that loves extravagantly. I believe the heart of that, if you understand, love is such a funny word to me. I think we almost lost its meaning. But I love the idea of compassion, that we share compassion extravagantly. I hurt for someone, and I'm willing to do what I can to help them. That's what I want to see, that kind of love. And when I'm so focus on the first two, you know what? I don't have fear. I witness boldly. I'll help. I'll speak. I'll do what needs to be done so somebody else just might see Jesus that day in me or in us. That's my challenge. It's this Saturday. Can we practice this every day and live it out in such a way that people see us as people who follow Jesus, who offer mercy, who offer compassion, who do good?